Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 5 of the Federation from Star Trek versus the Galactic Empire from Star Wars, a full breakdown with rules and different matchup scenarios. Also, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. I'd like to do a breakdown just like this one for a matchup between the Protoss and Eldar, but I've been putting it off because it intimidates me, so I decided to host the discussion on the subject on my Patreon if you want to join the discussion there. Also, big shout out to my first patron, thank you for supporting the channel. Alright then, on to the matchup. This will be part 5 of 8, where I cover the numerical component of each side, as well as production capabilities to increase those numbers. I'll also touch on how much of those numbers are tied up at any given time, doing things like keeping the respective side afloat, maintaining order, putting out fires, all that kind of thing. Again, this will be the Galactic Empire as of the Battle of Endor, except that the Rebellion does not exist, versus the Federation as of the Dominion War. We'll start with the broadest strokes by just looking at the territory held by each side. As you can see by this side-by-side comparison, the Galactic Empire holds significantly more territory than the Federation, amounting to about half their home galaxy, which is about 120,000 light years across, versus the Federation, which doesn't even hold a quarter of their home quadrant in the Milky Way galaxy, which is about 100,000 light years across. So the next logical question is, how many actually habitable worlds does each side actually have, and how populated are they? After all, if the Empire has 1 million worlds, but they all have similar populations to Tatooine, that doesn't actually amount to nearly as many people as if all of their worlds look more like Coruscant. Well, that requires a bit more digging, and unfortunately numbers vary wildly, but the most consistent figure I'm finding is that the Empire has about 1.5 million core worlds, plus an additional 50 to 70 million colonies, protectorates, puppets, all that kind of thing. So all told, the Empire has an overall population in the quadrillions, possibly in hundreds of quadrillions of people of various species. Meanwhile, the Federation has about 150 member worlds, plus an additional 1,000 or so additional colonies for a population of, who cares, the Empire outnumbers the Federation many times to over to 1. But that's not the whole picture. Let's keep going. On the ground, the Empire maintains a standing army of billions to trillions of soldiers. Again, it's unclear exactly how many, but probably trillions of soldiers in various roles. Meanwhile, the Federation doesn't really do armies, so I'll consider their ground forces as 0 to minimal. Really, they just take their security forces from ships and deploy them on the ground when necessary. They don't do armies. Finally, the actual fun bit. How many ships do each of them have? Well, this gets murky again, but what I can say for relatively certain is that the Imperial Navy consisted of around 25,000 Star Destroyers of various classes, around 13 Super Star Destroyers, and a single Death Star at the time in question. Specifically, the second Death Star, which gets to actually be completed for this scenario since the time frame is the Battle of Endor and the Rebels don't exist, so they actually have the time to finish it. In addition, the Empire had millions of ships overall, but this is actually kind of misleading because that includes every Star Destroyer, frigate, regular destroyer, and TIE Fighter in the Imperial Navy. And since every Imperial 2 Star Destroyer carried around 72 TIE Fighters, plus stations have their own contingent of fighters, as do various installations. We get to see this in other shows, like Andor. There's that base that they rob, and it has its own complement of TIE Fighters. That's not a ship, but it still counts toward that total. So yeah, you end up with a lot of number inflation just because of that. My point is, raw numbers don't mean much without context. Millions of Star Destroyers would be absolutely terrifying. Millions of fighters, a lot less so. Anyway, back on over to the Federation. Again, we don't have concrete numbers, but the best estimates I can find run between 8 to 10,000 ships at the start of the Dominion War. But since there was a full-on war with a numerically superior foe, the Federation ramped up their production, and by the end of the war, some 30,000 ships overall had been produced, but due to high attrition rates, they were only left with 4,000 to 7,000 ships by the end of the war. Basically, total, they produced 30,000, well, they went from 10,000-ish to 30,000, but they then lost like 20-some-odd thousand ships. Importantly, that's all classes of ships, but doesn't seem to include shuttles. Also important to note is that this doesn't mean that the Federation built thousands and thousands of Galaxy-class capital ships. Actual class distribution is unclear, but I think it's safe to say that far more light vessels like Miranda class, that kind of thing, were made than heavy capital ships. Finally, we need to look at actual fleet deployments. After all, it doesn't matter how many ships you have, it matters how many ships you can deploy. For the Federation, this is pretty simple. The largest fleet we ever see assembled was in the battle to retake Deep Space Nine and consisted of 600 Federation ships alongside some number of Klingon ships. For the Empire, it's a little more tricky. The largest fleet we ever see assembled was at the Battle of Endor, and that consisted of like 34 to 37 Star Destroyers of various classes, 1 Super Star Destroyer, 1 Death Star, and hundreds of fighters, as well as some number of smaller support craft, which they don't have those numbers. Well, that's an oddly small fleet. The thing is that this fleet was still overwhelmingly large for the task at hand, destroying the Rebel fleet, which was pretty tiny, and it had to be assembled in secret for Palpatine's trap to actually work, so really it's not particularly representative of what the Empire could actually muster against a full rival military. Don't forget that the Rebels were basically a collection of terrorist cells with very decentralized power, so giant fleet battles were pretty unusual. I think a far more representative figure is from the Battle of Coruscant at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, where the Republic fielded around 1,000 Venator-class Star Destroyers, along with a multitude of support craft and fighters. Estimates are a bit wacky here, since some sources claim that the Separatists attacked with over 10,000 of their own capital ships, which is frankly absurd, since that would be like the Empire, a far more established and militaristic faction, deploying almost half of their entire armada of ships to one battle. You don't do that. Yeah, I'll stick with the 1,000 Venators, and that is just the Venators. There would be support craft on top of that, but again, numbers are really unclear. So again, the Federation is outnumbered, but at least the gap is narrowing significantly. We're not going from trillions of soldiers to basically none. We're going from 1,000 ships to 600 ships. Pretty close. Not quite 2 to 1. Finally, we need to talk about industrial capacity. This is a bit nebulous since each side seems to just be able to pull ships and personnel out of nowhere, but we do have some info. As I mentioned earlier, it's estimated that the Federation was able to go from around 10,000 ships to 30,000 ships over the course of the Dominion War. Most of them were then lost, leaving them with less ships than when they started by the end. But needless to say, tripling your forces in around 2 years is pretty dang impressive. That said, again, that doesn't mean that they produced tens of thousands of Galaxy-class ships. More likely, the vast majority were the smaller workhorse classes like the Miranda. This production rate is aided significantly by things like industrial replicators, which cut out the need for massive factories by just producing ship components out of their constituent elements directly in seconds. You don't need to have a big old assembly line, you can just build it. This is outside of the scope a little bit, but Lower Decks did a pretty good job of showing the potential of industrial replicators. There was an episode where they had the automated Texas-class USS Aledo replicate entire colony structures and then just beam them down to planets before moving on and doing more of the same. So you just had colony infrastructure done in seconds. Meanwhile, the Imperial's most impressive feat of logistics was building the second Death Star to about 80% complete. I'm spitballing here because it's really unclear how much they actually had left to do. I mean, the super weapon was operational, but you can see that half the thing appears to not quite be done yet. In any case, they did that in about 4 years. Estimates vary wildly, but that was the equivalent to, by cost, building about 6,000 Star Destroyers, and by mass, more like 40,000 Star Destroyers. Presumably during this time, additional Star Destroyers were still being constructed at Imperial shipyards, so the second Death Star was in addition to that. It's also important to note that almost all Star Destroyers are larger and more massive than any Federation vessel. Slight tangent here, because this keeps coming up. Mass and size do not equal power. You can see this historically in both Trek and Wars, and in reality. The old V-2 rockets from World War II were about 14 meters tall, weighed about 12,000 kilograms while carrying about a 1,000 kilogram warhead. Meanwhile, a Tomahawk missile is about 6 meters long, weighs in at about 1,300 kilograms, and can deliver a variety of payloads including up to a 200 kiloton nuclear warhead, while being far more accurate and having over 4 times the range of the V-2. Clearly, bigger isn't necessarily better. In fact, I would argue it's usually worse unless you absolutely need the space. In Star Wars Legends, the Sun Crusher was the size of a shuttle, and it was far more dangerous than the Death Star, as it could cause stars to go nova and just take out their entire systems. Likewise, in Star Trek Voyager, given a few toys from the future, Voyager, a tiny Intrepid class, was able to take on the Borg, easily destroying multiple cubes, which had previously just shrugged off the combined firepower of whole fleets of Federation ships, and Voyager was able to just shrug off the Borg's counterattack while just one-shotting cubes. In short, in the immortal words of Yoda, size matters not. And no, I do not do a good Yoda impression, I'm sorry. It's also not necessarily reflective of how much time and effort something actually requires to build. A house is the size of a house, but it's far easier, faster, and cheaper to build than something like a supercomputer because, despite the computer being dimensionally smaller, for the purposes of this matchup, just like Star Destroyers are gigantic doesn't mean they're actually all that complicated to build. It's not like they need giant, rare kyber crystals like the Death Star does. Also, the actual numbers of shipyards in the Empire are quite limited compared to the size of Imperial territory, with even estimates from Legends, which always seems to inflate the heck out of things. Even Legends only has 67 major shipyards across 1.5 million worlds. Some of those are absolutely gigantic, with the Kuat shipyard being a ring around the entire planet with 5,781 individual construction slips, allowing the construction of literally hundreds of capital ships simultaneously. Again, that's dubious because it's Legends, but in any case, that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. But at the same time, they don't have access to things like industrial replicators, so they had to build everything the hard way. So what does this all mean? Well, honestly, it appears that when pressed, the tiny Federation actually has comparable shipbuilding capabilities to the mighty Empire. They built around 20,000 ships in 2 years, compared to the Empire building the equivalent of between 6 to 40,000 ships in 4 years, not including whatever their shipyards are doing, but let's just say they built another 6,000 ships in that time. That means that the Federation is behind still, but not by that much. In fact, if we go by cost instead of mass, the Federation comes out way ahead in terms of actual ship production. Finally, the last element to consider is how much of each side is actually tied up at any given time maintaining their respective territory. Both have their ships spread far and wide across their territory. Both can traverse their own territory in a relatively short time frame, the Federation because their territory is just tiny, and the Empire because their FTL is so freaking fast. The thing is, the Federation is a utopia where everyone actually wants to be a member, so the ships spread all over the place are doing things like research, moving ambassadors around, or dealing with rogue comets, stuff like that. The Empire, meanwhile, rules by fear, so the vast majority of their fleet at any given time is tied up maintaining order across their vast territory. They simply cannot divert most of their ships to any warfront because doing so would cause the entire empire to collapse. Also, look at the ships per capita, as it were. The Federation, pre-war, had about 7 ships per member world and colony. The Empire has about 2,000 plus planets per Star Destroyer. Huge their numbers might be, but practically speaking, they're stretched incredibly thin. Sure, they got fighters and such to help bolster those numbers, but remember that TIE fighters aren't hyperdrive equipped, so if a battle happens anywhere but in their backyard, they contribute nothing. Oh yeah, and I should also briefly touch on Force users. The Federation has various species with some level of supernatural ability, such as the telepathic and empathic Vulcans and Betazoids, but their abilities are relatively limited. Meanwhile, the Empire has Dark Lords of the Sith, all 2 of them, Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine. They also have Inquisitors, but as of Endor, all of them are either dead or disgraced, with the possible exception of the 4th sister who survived fighting Cal Kestis, but probably went rogue, Reva, who definitely went rogue, and Marek from Ahsoka, who might have been an Inquisitor once, but it's unconfirmed, and it's from Ahsoka, so who knows. So yeah, confirmed, the Empire has a whopping 2 Force users. But what do you all think? Am I being unfair in my assessment? Are my estimates way off? Honestly, on that one, I wouldn't be super surprised, but that's mainly because a lot of these estimates are just based on vibes. I'm doing what I can, I'm sorry, but I just don't actually have numbers. Neither side is willing to actually produce them. Probably because they'd realize immediately, everybody would point at it immediately and be like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Anyway, let me know what you all think in the comments. Again, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. Patreon is where I will be hosting a discussion regarding a breakdown just like this one for a matchup between the Protoss and Eldar that I've been putting off because it intimidates me. Huge shout out to my first patron, Aotis. Thank you so much for the support, it means a lot to me. And until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.